Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Welcome back to the podcast, dear listeners. Now, you may remember that in episode 60, I promised that I would record an interview with an expert guest on the topic of sex differences in resistance training. And today I have that expert guest. David, thank you very much for joining me.
It's a pleasure. Delight to be here. Thank you very much.
The first thing I always ask all of my guests is, who are you, what do you do, and why are you so awesome at it?
Oh God, I'll have to keep my ego in check. So professionally, I am an assistant professor of sport and exercise science at Dublin City University. So I teach across the undergraduate and postgraduate courses there in the area of strength and conditioning mainly. My research then focuses on sex differences in exercise. So I look at the question of, do males and females need to train differently, essentially, when it comes to physical preparation. So in particular for muscle hypertrophy, muscle strength increases, but then also strength and conditioning for sport. And I tend to focus more on the female athlete side of stuff. So looking at some questions such as, does the menstrual cycle impact performance? Do hormonal contraceptives impact performance and adaptation? Just so we can help prepare our female athletes better. So that's from a professional perspective. That's what I do day to day. But I also do work as a practitioner, as a strength and conditioning coach in elite sports settings then as well. So in Ireland we have Gaelic Games, so I work at the elite level in female Gaelic Games in Ireland. Outside of that, my own sporting history, I suppose, I have a background as a mediocre powerlifter. Would be the best way to describe myself. Ireland has a very competitive powerlifting scene, so I competed for a couple of years, but that's still much of the style of my training is powerlifting and strength based.
Very interesting. And thank you for the introduction, just so that the audience can learn a bit more about you. And all of the questions that you study in your research are the questions that I'm hoping to answer today. And the first one that I have for you is, what are the key differences between male and female physiology that would be reasonable to believe could impact hypertrophy and hypertrophy-specific training performance?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I suppose when I started out the PhD in this topic, that's what got me thinking at the start was, well, are there differences between males and females? And the simple answer is yes. We know that males and females are quite different. So there is this term called sexual dimorphism. And that's just a technical term that refers to a systematic difference in form between individuals of different sex within the same species. So that just basically means that, when you have a species such as humans, there are mean difference or average differences between males and females. And we see these differences in a lot of different anatomical and physiological systems. So, there is immunology, endocrinology, the hormones, cardiovascular. So when we look at males and females, we see even before people are born in that prenatal phase, there's a surge of testosterone in males, and this causes at birth and in the early years a difference in growth rate and growth velocity. But what does that mean for sport? So when we look at the average trained and say moderately or average untrained and moderately trained individual, we see a big difference between males and females in lean body mass. We know that males have about 45% higher lean body mass. We see that females tend to have higher fat mass. We see males having higher levels of strength, so about 55, 60% greater grip strength and a higher level of leg strength then as well. and we see a difference potentially in the type 2 to type 1 fiber ratio. But it goes beyond muscle. We tend to always focus on muscle and strength, but we see that males have longer and stronger bones. We see difference in tendon properties and tendon stiffness. And even in the more endurance side of stuff, we see difference in relative VO2 max and cardiovascular function, the cardiac output and hemoglobin levels. And that essentially that leads to what you hear sometimes coined as the male advantage in sport. I don't like the term advantage because again, that's putting a judgment on it because sport is not about competing males versus females. It's about within sex competition. But it just means that there is this biological basis for sex differences in sport, and we would expect, on average, depending on the sport, 10 to 30% difference in athletic performance between males and females. Now, why do I say all that? Well, if we see such a big difference in the physiology between males and females and the structure and performances we see, well, then it's not unreasonable to start questioning, well, should we maybe train differently or do we see differences in how people respond to the type of training? So when we look at kind of strength or hypertrophy from muscle growth, you would say, well, if males have a higher proportion of type 2 fibers or a higher ratio of them, they're bigger, they're stronger. Well, maybe that males and females respond differently. You'd expect maybe some males would respond better to resistance training. But when we look at the research on this, when we have males and females following the exact same resistance training protocols or programs, we don't see a difference really in relative increases in muscle growth and strength. Now that is relative. So if you increase your say both groups increase their bench press by 10% or gain 10% of muscle mass, well, if you have 50 kg of muscle mass when you're starting, you've gained 5 kg if we go up 10%. Whereas for a female, if she is 25 kg of lean muscle mass, she's gained 2.5 kilograms. So again, we always have to think in our heads the difference between relative and absolute. But when we account for differences in baseline strength and muscle mass and lean mass, we tend to see that males and females actually respond quite similarly to max resistance training protocols. And females might actually increase upper body strength a bit better than men. And that's based on some research by uh, Brandon Roberts and Greg Knuckles and that from 2020. We are updating that meta-analysis at the moment and seeing um, similar findings then as well. So that is said that males and females respond quite similarly to resistance training. And even when you look at the muscle fiber level, yes, there's differences in the type 2 to type 1 fiber ratio potentially, because there are a lot of limitations around how we measure that. But at the single muscle fiber level, there are not major differences, or if any, between males and females that you wouldn't expect them to respond greatly differently. Now, there is a caveat I will put in there. While we do see that similar rates of muscle growth, relative muscle growth, the majority of that research is on untrained individuals. I would have a hypothesis. Again, this is not based on existing research, but it's just a hypothesis that as you become more trained, I do think that you see males probably have a more um, are more capable of continuing to gain muscle mass in the long term. I think you would see that relative increase slow down, and that's just based on you tend to see males who, as they continue to train and even stay natural, they can get quite big. They start off quite skinny, but they end up quite big. You don't tend to see females get to huge sizes in muscle hypertrophy while being natural. So I do think as you become more trained, maybe we will see a difference. But as it stands, there doesn't seem to be a huge difference between males and females when it comes to their ability to increase muscle mass and increase strength.
That's really interesting. Thanks for explaining that. And do you have a theory, a personal theory at this point regarding why natural females don't tend to see the same increase in muscle size as a male
Hmm. I
once they
don't.
are well trained, that is?
Yeah, I don't. It's a good question. No, again, I'm speaking completely off the cuff here. It gets complex. we need to see. There does seem to be some research to suggest that the ability to increase muscle mass beyond a certain point is linked to actually bone density, and it makes sense.
Hmm.
There seems to be this crosstalk communication between bone and muscle that potentially could have some links to hypertrophy levels. Now, again, this is me completely going with hypotheses rather than something that's concrete, so don't take this as fact. But I
Hmm.
think that that difference in baseline levels of bone and tendon properties in females, because the bones are, were weaker and the tendons the same, I think as you get on, the muscle growth and strength doesn't increase to the same level, or at least the muscle growth doesn't, because maybe some of these differences in tendons and bones. But again, that's completely just my conjecture. It would be very interesting to see. But first of all, I don't want to hypothesize too much on why this might be, because we don't not even know if this is the case. We don't know if,
That's
as they
true.
become more trained, that females have less. This is something we need to research. But if it were the case, there are some potential mechanisms of why it might be. But again, let's not get ahead of ourselves, because we don't even know if that is the case in the first place.
That's true. I got too excited about what's in the end observation at this point. That's what we're observing. We don't know if it's actually happening because we've not conducted a research study on it. Thank you for pulling me up on that. All right. So it seems like the average response between sexes, relatively speaking, is the same when it comes to response to training. That is. Now, I'm wondering, there are certain aspects of female physiology specifically that could be considered or could be reasonably thought to have an effect on this training performance. For example, now it's become quite popular, especially in America, to promote the idea of cycle syncing, or the idea that you should change your training based on the phase of the menstrual cycle that you're in. So, first, I'd like to ask if you could define the menstrual cycle and its different phases to bring everybody up to speed. And then I would like to know your thoughts on this idea of menstrual cycle syncing.
Sure. So the menstrual cycle itself, just as a very simplistic overview, it is this cyclic fluctuation in ovarian sex hormones in females. So the purpose of the menstrual cycle is to prepare the female body for the possibility of pregnancy on a close to monthly basis. So you could break the menstrual cycle up into 6 phases, really. But to keep it simple, as an overview, you tend to have the menstrual cycle starts on day zero, which is the first day of the period, the first day of the menstrual bleed. At that stage, that's a low hormone phase. So both estrogen and progesterone, the two main ovarian hormones people tend to talk about when it comes to the menstrual cycle, both those hormones are low. As you progress through this first half of the menstrual cycle, which is called the follicular phase, we start to see estrogen levels slowly start to rise. When we get to when estrogen levels get to a high enough level, that triggers a luteinizing hormone surge, or an LH surge, which causes ovulation to occur. So ovulation is the release of the egg. So we see that at around just before ovulation, estrogen levels are at a high and progesterone levels are at a low. We see estrogen then drop back down after ovulation, and as we move then past ovulation, which separates the follicular and the luteal phase, the second half of the menstrual cycle is referred to as the luteal phase. And we see during that luteal phase, we start to see progesterone start to rise high. Estrogen does rise with it. Um, and we have that in the luteal phase. And then as we come back towards the next period, beginning next menstrual bleed, we see both those hormones start to decrease. So, in an overview, what you have is around this, first, 1 to 7 days, this first week, you could say you have a low estrogen, low progesterone, low hormone phase. As you get into this mid to late follicular phase, you have high estrogen, low progesterone. Then, as you get into the mid luteal phase, the middle of that luteal phase, you have both high estrogen and high progesterone. So that is what would be a typical menstrual cycle, or I wouldn't even use the word typical now. That is what is a textbook overview of what a normal eumenorrheic, naturally functioning menstrual cycle would look like. Now, we can get into some of the issues around that in terms of there are loads of different hormonal profiles, and we cannot assume that every woman has a normal menstrual cycle or this hormonal profile. This is just what it looks like in textbooks. But the idea then around cycle syncing is, well, in this first half of the menstrual cycle, the follicular phase, when you've high estrogen, low progesterone, the idea is that estrogen is an anabolic hormone, that people would be stronger, recover better, and have maybe more tolerance for higher volumes of training, and would have a more propensity to increase muscle growth, and would respond better to training in this first half of the menstrual cycle. Then in the second half of the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, progesterone is supposed to be anti-estrogenic. So you hear people say it's catabolic, but technically it's anti-estrogenic. So it inhibits the effects of estrogen. And the idea would be that it, in theory, would lead to reduced recovery, reduced ability to handle volume and intensity, and reduced adaptive capacity. That all sounds lovely in if you know everyone was what we are in the textbooks, but women aren't that. So when we look at the actual research then around, well, the idea is phase-based training, then cycle syncing. In that first 2 weeks, go heavy, go higher volume. In the second 2 weeks, ease it off, lower volume, lower intensity, recovery-based stuff. It's very nice in theory. Um, in practice, it is not an evidence-based thing to do. There is no strong evidence-based, scientific base for promoting this style of training, especially not at a group level. At a population level, we cannot say that it is effective. It's so it's based on this textbook viewpoint of how the hormones work. First and foremost, it's very reductionist, it's very simplistic, and it assumes that everyone is the same, but we know it's not the case. We know that, just because two women are having a menstrual bleed, both of them are having a period, it does not mean that they have a normal menstrual cycle. You know, if we are looking to look at the hormonal profiles of women, and we're say trying to track it in a team setting, and we want to establish the hormonal profiles, the first thing we tend to do is, well, are they bleeding every month? Are they bleeding regularly? Is the cycle length, a normal menstrual cycle is anywhere from 21 to 35 days. Are they regularly bleeding? And is the menstrual cycle length in relatively stable? Once we know that, well, we can't assume that ovulation is occurring. We can't assume that we're getting this increase in estrogen, because we can have an ovulatory cycle, that is, where the period occurs, but ovulation doesn't happen. So the next we have to start to establish is, well, does ovulation actually occur? Are we getting this high level of estrogen? We do that through ovulation kits. So, where you get women to pee on the strip, and that can detect this luteinizing hormone, this LH surge in the blood. So if you get that LH surge, you can be pretty confident that you've had high estrogen level there, a spike in estrogen, because that's what causes the LH to be released. But so that's fine. So you know that you have the menstrual bleedings happen. You know that you have ovulation occurring, that you're getting this spike in estrogen. But we have something called uh, luteal progesterone deficiency, where just because the ovulation occurs, we don't know that we get this rise in progesterone in the mid luteal phase. And if we're not getting that rise in progesterone, we're not getting that rise in estrogen there either. So potentially, we can have the case we're not getting that. So we would need to then take a blood sample to make sure that we're getting that rise in progesterone in that luteal phase. And if we confirm there, now we can confirm that we have a normal menstrual cycle. But that takes a lot of work. You need to have a blood sample in the luteal phase that's analyzed in a lab. You need to confirm ovulation. So a lot of these apps that are recommending cycle syncing, what are they doing? They're just recording when someone bleeds, has a menstrual bleed, and they're inferring, they're assuming that ovulation occurs. They're assuming that the progesterone rises in the luteal phase. But we can have a case where someone has a menstrual bleed, they don't have ovulation, they don't get luteal, and the hormones are flat for a lot of the month. You can have a case where someone, has a menstrual bleed, they don't have ovulation, and they get a rise in um, progesterone or something else. You can have that occur. But what also is interesting when you start to look at it, you can have a lot of women that have a 28-day cycle. In one woman, their follicular phase might be 7 days, and their luteal phase is 21 days. Where another one, their follicular phase might be 21 days, and their luteal phase is 7 days. And you have everything in between then. So if you're going on these apps or these people that are promoting cycle syncing, and they're just saying, oh, record when you bleed and record the next time you bleed, split that in half. In the middle is ovulation, and then you follicular, then you've luteal. You are going on so many different levels of assumption there around what the hormonal profile is, around the phase length. So that's the first issue. They think they're lining up with their menstrual cycle, but they don't even have a clue what their menstrual cycle is or what their individual athlete's menstrual cycle is. Unless you're going to that level of testing, you're just making assumptions and you don't really know. Now, that's the first thing. You don't know what the hormonal profile is in most cases, and you're trying to line up your training with the hormonal profile without even knowing what that is. If you did have it, you're going to find huge variation across all individuals. So now what do you do? If someone has a 7 day follicular phase, do you train them really hard for 1 week and then train them easy for 3 weeks? That to me sounds like nonsense. It wouldn't be something we would do. Um, so we have some of these limitations. So that's the first thing in terms of, and please stop me at any point if you want me to clarify anything. But that's the first issue. We don't know what the hormone cycle is. Then the second is, okay, if you did train people that way, when volume is matched on the few handful of studies we have, we don't see really much of a difference between um, phase-based training or uh, traditional resistance training. So it's pretty much the same outcome. Um, so my argument would be there's no evidence to support it. People don't actually understand the menstrual cycle that they're supposed to be lining stuff up with. So it's all based on hormonal theory, but not actual scientific evidence to support it. So it can't be, you can't make these recommendations at a group level because there's too much variations. At an individual level, if you worked with an individual, you track their menstrual cycle, and you got to the level where you started experimenting with phase-based training based on that individual. By all means, yes, I think at an individual level you can get to somewhere where, oh, we experimented and this phase-based training does seem to work better than traditional for this athlete or for this individual. It takes a lot of work to get there. I don't think that you would actually see that much of a difference in the outcome in terms of the strength or hypertrophy adaptations at the end of it. Um, and for me, it really overcomplicates things and also is maybe a barrier because we don't have enough women who engage in resistance training, who engage in strength training in the first place. And now we're telling them, okay, but if you do engage in it, well, you have to line it up with your menstrual cycle because, this, that, and the other. And if you don't, you're going to leave gains on the table. But even in theory, if it was true, if it was a case that in the luteal phase you had a reduced ability for adaptation, you still have an ability for adaptation. You still have an adaptive capacity. It's not a case that, oh, if you train for hypertrophy in the luteal phase, you will lose muscle. That's nonsense. You're still going to train the same way as if you were going to do it. And okay, you could say someone feels a bit more tired in the luteal phase. Well, that's just coaching. If we bring it, say, okay, we'll bring the volume down a bit. But the big thing is in that follicular phase, in theory, estrogen's high, you could be strong. Some people don't feel strong in the follicular. Some people feel strongest around their period. Some people feel strongest around their luteal. Some people feel strongest around the follicular phase or around ovulation. It is widely varied between individuals, but between cycles then as well. One menstrual cycle will be very different to the next menstrual cycle in a lot of cases. So you've just so much variation between individuals and between cycles within individuals and variation in the symptoms reported and the perceived effects. You cannot make a blanket recommendation of how everyone should train when you have so much variation. Like if I turned around and said, you're a man, this is the way you should train to increase hypertrophy, that would seem ridiculous, wouldn't it? We'd say, Oh, well, there's general principles, but we have to treat the individual. We have to look at the individual, track their data over a long period of time, try to identify patterns and responses, and based upon those patterns and responses we observe, put in plans and interventions, and then, a trial and error that over time to get the best thing for the individual. Well, there is a term for that process. It's called coaching and just being a good coach. So again, I don't think we need to overcomplicate things with phase-based training. In theory, in the future, it is an avenue that's worth exploring. The science should look at it as a potential strategy, but based on current scientific evidence, there is no evidence to support that phase-based training is superior to traditional resistance training or that it is even necessary. And then I won't even get into the world of sport where you have a team of 40 athletes who all compete on the same day, who all have to train at the same time with 40 different menstrual cycles, or half of them are on contraceptives, so they don't even have a menstrual cycle. So from a logistical perspective, it's near impossible to implement in a high performance environment.
Oh yeah, could you imagine? Today is technically your luteal phase, so you're weaker, so you're benched. You're not playing today. How does that even work?
Yeah, exactly. And I think our communication, the way for me, it's when we have to be careful how we use our language with our athletes in terms of we tend to view the menstrual cycle in a very negative light. We focus on
Hmm.
how it's going to make you weaker. Where, you know, if we go into an athlete and we start to, well, next week you're in the luteal phase, you're going to feel shitty, you're going to feel weak. Well, this creates a placebo or a nocebo effect. And we can create a self fulfilling prophecy where someone's like, well, next week's my luteal phase. I know I'm going to be weaker. And I'm like, whoa, 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 you don't know that. I was like, let's see how you feel next week. Let's not assume how you're going to feel because we don't know how we're going to feel.
I completely agree with that psychological aspect. That's why in my coaching practice, I track the menstrual cycle with all of my clients who have it, whether they identify as a woman or not. But I always, when they start out, often they've never done it. They've never seen the connection between potentially the menstrual cycle, how it makes them feel, and training and nutrition. So I try to use very neutral language. I say, let's track it and see how you respond if you have a response, because I also find that in some people, there are no symptoms ever. They're like, they feel the same way pretty much throughout the entire cycle. And then in some people, there are really strong responses depending on the different phase. So I never want anybody to feel that uh, there is going to be a response, and particularly that they needs to be viewed in a negative light, as you say, because I feel that my personal opinion is that we all have certain physiology, and we have no control over it. We can either work against it and view in this negative light, or we can work with it. And since so much about, at the end of the day, the biggest, in my opinion, contributor to positive adaptations is consistency. And consistency is very much about your mindset. If you have a negative mindset about the process, in my opinion, you're not going to be as consistent as you could be, and you're not going to get the positive adaptations that you could get.
Yeah, exactly. And as a coach, that's probably the best thing we can do because most coaches don't have the ability to track, for progesterone and get blood samples and that. So at a base level, there that is okay to do. And what we should do is okay, track your menstrual cycle. Essentially, we're not even tracking the menstrual cycle. We're tracking menstrual bleeds. It's usually all we're doing is when one period occurs and when the next occurs. And over time, track, symptoms, how you feel, how you perform in the gym, and try identify patterns, but acknowledge that there may not be patterns whatsoever. Don't try to find something or kind of will something to be there. But if you saw a consistent pattern, such as cramping during the period, for example, um, that people are like, oh, I tend to cramp during the period, but then they report in the week before their period that they always have night sweats or something like that and poor sleep. Well, then a straightforward thing to do as coaches, okay, during your period, you always seem to cramp a little bit. The week leading up to your period, you tend to always have night sweats. Maybe hydration might be an issue here. So we just pay a bit more attention to water and electrolyte intake around this week before the period and into the period phase. that's fine from coaching level. That's the kind of practical strategies you can put in place as a coach. You don't need to overcomplicate it with, we're going to do 12 sets at high intensity in the follicular, and I know your luteal starts here, so we're going to bring it down to lower sets, lower intensity. It's like, no, that's overcomplicated. Just how can you make, if there are symptoms that potentially could lead to reduced intensity or reduced motivation or adherence to training, how can we adjust or put some protocols in place to accommodate the individual to be able to be more consistent and to still train and get the adaptations that they want.
I agree. And I'm glad that you brought up the potential existence of patterns and the potential regularity of them, because you did mention that there is a lot of variability between individuals in terms of their cycle, but there's also a lot of variability within an individual regarding
Yeah,
their cycles.
huge, and we see that in terms of, as I said, no two menstrual cycles are ever the same, even within an individual. That the symptoms 1 month can be existent and they may not get the same symptoms next month, or the severity of those symptoms, if they are there, can fluctuate month to month. But also, we can see that phase length from month to month slightly change within individuals, or their menstrual cycle length change. So you will see some people, and you can even see it consistently when you track actually over years. It's interesting. You can see at different times of the years, at the year, things tend to change as well. So there can be obviously external factors, which maybe one part of someone's year is more stressful than the other consistently, and that can have an impact. So the menstrual cycle is very susceptible to both internal, external um, sources of stress that can lead to perturbations or changes within the menstrual cycle. So it's not a fixed thing within an individual. It is very dynamic and variable to a certain degree.
Thank you for the further clarification. Now, I was wondering, so this idea of menstrual cycle syncing is based on the supposition that performance and adaptation might differ between phases of the cycle. I'm wondering if there's any research showing that there is a difference in training performance between phases of the cycle. I know for a fact that a lot of people who do have symptoms in different phases report a perception of difference in training performance. But when it's actually measured in research, is the perception also reality?
So this is what's really, and this is what I find interesting in this. So when we look at the research, there is this thing that I tend to call a dichotomy dilemma. Essentially, in here is when we look at the body of evidence comparing menstrual cycle phases to each other. So luteal phase to follicular phase, and we have great meta-analyses done by the likes of Percy Elliott Sale, Kelly McNulty, these individuals.
Hmm.
We see that when we look at it objectively at a group level, there is effect of no consistent effect of the menstrual cycle on um, strength related or endurance related, pardon me, endurance related variables or endurance related performance. So, as I say, there's no strong research to show that menstrual cycle phase has an effect on performance. And there is a large scale project going on at the moment, the Feminine project, that is doing the perfect study, looking at high samples, looking at all these variables with good control, good level of blood samples, and we imagine would show the same thing. But there is no strong evidence to support a menstrual cycle phase has an effect on performance. But that said, when you go into the qualitative research and you start to survey and speak to women, you get this high prevalence of symptoms. A lot of people report symptoms, and they're very wide ranging in terms of the symptoms that they're reporting that are attributed to the menstrual cycle. And you also get a significant proportion of individuals stating that they perceive it affects their performance in one phase over the other. So where does that leave you? That leaves you a case of, okay, all these women are telling us these are the symptoms I get from the menstrual cycle. This is, and I perceive it to influence my performance. When you measure objectively in the lab, there's no effect upon performance. Um, so you start to say, well, what's this contradiction? Well, there's a few potential reasons for it. First of all, statistics is probably one of the issues in terms of when we look at lab-based stuff and we're say comparing one phase to the other. What are we doing? We're getting a group of women and we're testing them in one phase, comparing them to the other. We're getting a group average and we're comparing our averages or our means there. When we compare means and we look for a statistical significance difference between two means, two averages, it's down to the level of variance we see. So there's a difference in one average, one mean to the next, but it's also that standard deviation, this variance that we see, and it's comparing variances. So, as we said, if we have a huge level of variance between individuals that it's so wide, well, we get this overlaying of the variance and we get no statistical significant difference. So, that's probably one reason. We're not finding a consistent effect at a group level. So
Mm.
maybe in the statistics, we need to go into more individualized and look at the variance of response. So that's potentially one issue. It's a statistics issue. Um, but then the other issue could be, well, when we see the hormone levels change, we know that they have an effect upon psychology um, and um, and mood state. So people are perceiving it to be harder or perceiving, and what does that mean? That just means that the weights feel heavier, or that when you're starting getting close to failure, like, oh, this is tough. You feel it's tough. So what we might be the case is at a neuromuscular level, when we see the change in menstrual cycle phase, that someone's ability to produce force to actually stimulate the muscle and get force output might be actually relatively unaffected, but how they perceive any given workload. You see an increased RPE for the same workload in one phase of the other. So it just might feel harder. So it could be a case that, look, you're just as strong, you can still push as much weight, it just feels harder. Now, that is not to say that it is all in their head. That is the wrong interpretation of it. But if something feels harder, well, then effectively it is harder. When we quit in on the pitch, when we don't make a run, or when we, put down a weight or we stop doing reps, a lot of the time, most of the time, you're stopping because it just feels too hard. You could probably push a little bit more or hold that isometric failure point for a bit longer, but you don't because you're like, oh, that's too tough, and I give up. You will give up at the time before the muscle actually properly stops working or stops being able to give out that force output. So if that it changes, then that's how your performance might change. So that has a real effect on performance if that is the case. Um, so that is to summarize menstrual cycle phase. At the moment, there's no research to say that it has a strong, consistent effect across individuals. It seems to be again highly individual. And this perfect project, this is what I talk about, the Feminate project, that's going to be really expensive, really time consuming, but because there is certain people's like, oh, the menstrual cycle has to have an effect. We're just not found. We haven't found it yet. Well, this perfect study, what do we expect it to find? Do we expect it to find a uniform response where yes, there's a very distinct, consistent difference between luteal phase and follicular phase across individuals? Or do we expect it to find huge amounts of inter-individual differences that some people are affected, some people aren't, and inter-individual, and some people are affected in one cycle and not the other? What do we expect to find? Well, we'd expect to find the second one, where we have a huge level of individual difference. And again, that comes back to, well, what does that mean for practice? It means track the individual, put in individual coping strategies if needed, and tweak them over time. It's just coaching. So I joked with the leader, Kirsty Elliott last week, who's leading this project. I joked with her that you're going to spend a lot of money, a lot of time, and your study will not change practice in the slightest. Um, and that's what she suspects as well. But we need this study done so we can tick this off and say, look, menstrual cycle is not something that you need to worry about, and stop putting it as a barrier for our female athletes.
And sometimes that's the value of science to prove that what we're already doing is correct.
Yes. Yes, essentially, yeah. So it's just a falsification here that we need to just get it done, ticked off, and kind of people be put the naysayers to bed, and then we can move on. to more important research in supporting our female athletes.
I completely agree. Thank you for that excellent answer. Now, moving on from the menstrual cycle, I want to explore another area or another factor that might be reasonably considered to have an effect on training response. And this is a factor that you've actually just authored a paper on, and it's hormonal contraceptive use. So, to start with, again, could you bring everyone up to speed and explain how birth control works and what different types are available?
Yeah, no problem at all. So this is what I find funny is when we talk about the sex differences in the female side of stuff, everyone wants to talk about the menstrual cycle. But 40 to 50% plus of your female athletes um, are going to be on some form of hormonal contraceptives, so they don't have a menstrual cycle. So hormonal contraceptives are they're exogenous, so meaning that we're taking them from outside the body, um, concentrations of um, estradiol and progesterone, so synthetic estrogen and progesterone that we put into the body, that we take into the body. Um, and they are primarily used for, well, they're designed to prevent pregnancy, but they're used for a wide range of reasons across individuals. But what they are then is just different forms, different ways of taking progesterone or estrogen um, to prevent pregnancy. So we take in these exogenous hormones, they shut down endogenous production, so you stop producing your own endogenous, and because they keep the hormones at a certain concentration, they prevent pregnancy from occurring because you're not getting this ovulation, and you're not getting the buildup of the endometrium then as well, that would cause fertilization or to facilitate fertilization. How they are taken, there's many different forms. There's injectable, there's patches, there's vaginal rings. You then see, but the most common ones that people are probably familiar with is implants. So you have hormonal and non-hormonal intrauterine devices. So you hear this referred to as the coil. You have implants in the arm, but in young active females, the most popular one that we tend to see used is the oral contraceptive pill. So what people would anecdotally know refer to as the pill. So again, that's a tablet that people take every day. And there's different forms of this. You have mono, bi, and triphasic forms, and that just basically refers to the kind of dosages of the and concentration of the dosages of the hormones and how they change across the the dosage cycle. But a lot of people will be taking these combined oral contraceptive pills, and that means that it contains both an estrogen and progesterone component. You have progestin only pills that some people take, but most people are probably going to be taking a combined oral um, contraceptive pill, which has progesterone and estrogen in it. Generally, you will see people recommended that they take it for 21 days. Then they have 7 days where they take a kind of placebo pill or a pill free period. During that 7 days, there is a bleed that occurs. That's a withdrawal bleed, and that's just because you've come off the hormones for that 7 days. People will conflate that and confuse that with a period bleed, a menstrual bleed. It's not the same thing. You're not having a period. You're just having bleeding occur because you've come off these tablets. So we'll have people say, "Oh well, I have a perfect menstrual cycle because every time I come off my pill, I bleed." That doesn't mean anything at all. Many people will actually just take the pills, not have their 7 pill-free days and just stay on it right through. But you take the pills, they put a level of hormones, exogenous hormones in the body, and endogenous hormone production stops. So you don't get this massive spike in estrogen in the follicular phase. You don't get huge fluctuations in the luteal. It's rather, the idea is for most protocols that it keeps a consistent level of hormones across the cycle. So that's what they are. In terms, then the idea is, well, do they have a negative impact upon adaptation? So when we look at performance, first and foremost, we know again a great meta-analysis done a couple of years ago by Kelly McNulty, a colleague of mine. showed on acute performance that when you compare people on the pill versus those that are naturally menstruating, there might be a trivial, like really, really small negative impact of the pill on performance. But again, that's just cross section, just looking at pill users versus non users. How did it perform? Oh, the hormonal contraceptive group seemed to be slightly inferior to the naturally menstruating group. But at a practical level, there was no difference really. So I collaborated with Kelly. She was a co-author of mine on this project as well. We then did a meta-analysis where we compared all the evidence that we have at the moment, and we were interested in, well, when pill users, or we were interested in hormonal contraceptive users and naturally menstruating women um, follow the same resistance training protocol, do we see a difference in the adaptations in strength, power, or hypertrophy in response to resistance exercise training? We reviewed all the science, all the literature in the area. No papers have looked at anything other than the pill. So we only ended up looking at the oral contraceptive pill. And what we found is when you compare pill users to non-pill users, there are no differences in hypertrophy, strength, or power adaptations following the same resistance protocol. Because the idea was, well, in the naturally menstruating, if that follicular phase was really anabolic, well, maybe they'd gain a bit more muscle in that phase or a bit more strength in that phase, um, so that they'd be taking advantage, quote unquote, of that phase. But we found that not to be the case. Based on the current level of evidence, there is no reason to advocate for or against the use of oral contraceptive pills in people who wish to maximize muscle hypertrophy, strength, or power. So there's no reason to think that they benefit any of those adaptations, and there's no reason to think that they would negatively impact. So it seems to be a neutral effect. Now, that said, there are, some limitations in the current body of research. We need more research and better quality research to look at it. But you'll have people that will confidently say, oh, the pill ruins your gains or the pill is negatively impacting your performance. There is no research to support that at present. Yes, in the future, research might emerge that does find that, but based on the current body of evidence, there's no reason that someone should be recommending someone either go on or go off the pill for the purpose of muscle hypertrophy, strength, or power gains. Now, that said, it is not the place of a coach to recommend someone go on or off the pill either, in any circumstance. That's a conversation between an individual and their medical professional, and that is not something that we should really be prying too much into as coaches.
I completely agree with that. Now, something that I just want to clarify for the listeners, in case it was implied in what you were saying, but we didn't really spell it out. You were very careful in saying pill users. You didn't refer to people who use any kind of a birth control or contraceptive, not oral contraceptive, any kind of contraceptive. So what I'm trying to say here is that one aspect of the body of research that we need to take into account is that, as far as I know, the most amount of research has been done on the pill or oral contraceptive use, but there isn't a lot of research on the other methods. Is that right?
Yeah, when we look at the effect of exercise performance or adaptation, how we respond to exercise, it is primarily only the oral contraceptive pill. We haven't seen any research that's looking at, say, the implant or the intrauterine device or patches, these other methods of deliveries of these synthetic ovarian hormones. So, yes, all I'm saying is based on the pill. Are there potential reasons why other contraceptive methods might differ? Potentially, because again, we see a huge level of variation in response. You will see people who get an intrauterine device, for example, to get an implant, um, and they get very negative symptomology based upon that, and they have to get it removed because it didn't suit them, and then they go on the pill. Or the other way around, some people go on the pill and it doesn't suit them, and they end up going getting an implant or something like this. So if you see such variation in the side effects of the contraceptive use, then maybe potentially yes, the method of delivery does have an impact upon what goes on in the body. But again, it's too early to have any conjecture on that. We should have, and we did call for that. The research should look at other methods of contraceptive, not just the oral pill.
Thank you. I thought that was very important to clarify for the listeners. Now, I know we have 10 minutes left, so I only have one question. If that's okay with you.
Of course, of course.
So we circling back to the beginning, we said that there is no relative difference in the response to adaptation between the sexes. Now, having said that, in the research that I have seen, which at this point is dated by at least a few years, so I'm not sure if there has been any change. But in the research that I was looking at a few years ago, it seemed like people who are assigned female at birth and have the hormonal milieu that we identify with that of a cis woman, they seem to recover faster between sets and from entire training sessions. They seem to be able to do maybe a few more sets in one workout or across a period of training. They seem to be able to do more reps at a similar percentage of their one repetition max, and they seem to be able to lift less absolute weight. However, for that percentage of one repetition max, I'm wondering if these differences are still true as far as you know, if they're still visible in research, and if what to make of them essentially.
Yes, this is an interesting one, and this is where probably you can start to wrap it up around how do they need to train differently is the ultimate
Yeah.
question we're coming down to here now. So when we look at the difference, you're correct in saying there is some research to suggest that in high intensity efforts that females might respond a bit better and recover a bit better between them. Where we tend to see that is a lot in isometric based research. So it's, they have a better ability to hold a plank for longer, to hold
Mm.
a wall squat or something like that. So there's less research in isotonic or, just normal muscle contraction, dynamic muscle contraction. So we need more research there. But that said, and this is again where I start to switch from entirely empirical, based on the evidence, to also bringing in my anecdotal and opinion based on this. So we do see this idea that intraset recovery is better in females, and females, tend to recover a bit quicker between sets, and they can go harder, and then that infers that they can maybe do a bit more volume overall. Um, when we see actually day-to-day recovery, there's not a huge difference in neuromuscular recovery in the like 48 hours, 72 hours post session
Mm.
when it's matched. But I think you are correct. Anyone that works with female athletes, you will see it that you can seem to throw more volume at them. You can
Yeah.
seem to, and they come. I was like, "Oh, were you sore yesterday?" Like, a bit. I'm like, "Oh, okay." And even to get through the sets quicker. Now, one question that needs to be explored in all this, and you're correct, and James Steele and Jim Nuzzo have a new paper out recently where they looked at these reps to failure, this reps continuum, and you do see that at a submaximal load, um, at the high max, so at 90 percent 1RM, females can do more reps than males at the same, at say 90% of the 1RM. And you see it at 50, 60% then as well. 70, 80%, actually, it's pretty matched, but it seems to be at certain percentages, submaximal percentages, females can do more reps when it comes to failure. What question I come up with all this, and what I spend a lot of time thinking about, is what proportion of the difference is a true sex difference? It is a
Yes.
difference due to the physiology, and what difference is down to absolute load, or absolute load on the bar. And what I mean by that, as you work with athletes, female athletes, as they get stronger, you tend to see that ability to recover between sets come down. You tend to see that ability to handle the higher volumes come down.
Hmm.
So if you have two individuals, let's say males, for example, anyone that knows anyone who is strong, and I mean actually really strong. So
Hmm.
there's one person comes from my mind, a lifter in Dublin here, squats 400 kilos. So he can squat 400 kilograms. He will squat once every 12 days, you know. Um, And that's because if he tries to squat any more than that, he just can't handle it. His body just can't take it. Because if you squat 400 kilos, and let's say versus someone that squats 100 kilos, well, if both of those individuals work at 80% of the 1RM, that's 80 kilograms for the weaker person, but that is 320 kilograms for the stronger person. Both of them are working at 80% of their max. Do we honestly think that both of those people will have the same level of decrement, or this will recover the exact same after those two sessions? No, of course not. I don't think we would expect it. So yes, we relative load is important, but the absolute load does actually make a difference on the system because you're putting
Hmm.
such a huge load on the system. So my question is, is it, do they recover quicker and be able to handle the more volumes because there's a sex difference there and female physiology is so different? Or is it because they're just weaker? And I don't say that in a condescending way. I say that in a, we know a baseline level of strength difference is 50 to 60%, depending on the measure. So if the absolute load they're using is probably a bit, 50 to 60% a bit less, well, then yes, I would expect them to recover because the absolute magnitude of stress being put on them in that set is not equivalent. So this global level of stress is different between individuals. It's like we see 100-meter sprinters at the elite level. When they race, they're done for days after that. They've put such a huge strain on the nervous system that they can't go again for a week. Where if I went out and sprinted as hard as I can, yes, I'm working at 100%, but I could do that every day because I don't generate enough force to stress the nervous system to such a high degree. Um, so that's what we need to understand. Is it absolute load? Is it a sex difference? Because when you see them get stronger, their ability to do that high level of recovery does come down. There could be some, fiber typology differences, type 1 to type 2, that potentially does lead to this difference. And also, females, in my experience, tend to be a bit more hesitant to go heavier, as in to push closer to failure. You have to take a bit longer to say, no, you need to go heavier. So if they tend to be working a bit further away from failure at a higher reps in reserve compared to males with a lower load on the bar, well, then yes, I would expect them to recover quicker between sets and between sessions and to handle more volume. Um, so that said, there are some of the nuances around that, and we see this in recoverability and reps of failure. But again, yes, this is a mean difference. What you tend to see is huge variation. So just
Hmm.
because they're female uh, doesn't mean that they're automatically going to be able to handle that huge amount of volume. You would still get some that can handle much more volumes than others, some that recover better than others. So you're going to see that individual differences in there. But to kind of wrap it up, this question of based upon these, so they would be some of the things that I would say people are like, okay, well, if there's recovery differences, repetitions, that's actually one of the nuances. If we know that females can do higher reps with given percentages or submax, I don't use percentage based programming with females. I won't say do 6 reps at 70% because all those ideas of these percentages are based on male data. I would
Hmm.
rather use reps in reserve to make sure that they're going in a proximity to failure to get the adaptation. Because if I give a male and a female reps at say 70%, 6 reps at 70% or 80%, that's going to put the male closer to failure than it'll put the female to failure on average. So that's why I've used reps in reserve so that we're going the standard proximity to failure. But with these different nuances, you start to ask yourself, well, do they need to train differently? Well, when I design a training program, what do we do? First thing we do is a needs analysis. We say, well, what do we want to get? Where do we need to get to? Where's our athlete now? When you identify that needs analysis, you say, well, what adaptations do I want to occur? What am I aiming for in terms of adaptations? Adaptation doesn't have a sex dimension to it. Hypertrophy is hypertrophy, strength is strength. Adaptations don't have a sex dimension. So you can go on to the next thing. When you're clear on the adaptation you're trying to achieve, the next question is what principles do I need to apply to drive that adaptation? Progressive overload, specificity, all these type of things. Well, again, there's no sex dimension. Progressive overload is the same across both sexes. So adaptation um, and principles are the exact same across both sexes. So then you come down to, well, now that I'm clear on what adaptation I want to occur, I know what principles I need to apply. The next thing is, well, what methods can I apply that, or can I put in place and use that apply a principle that drive the adaptation? And then you say to yourself, okay, methods, potentially this is the only area where we could have a need for a sex difference. And what are our methods as a coach? It all comes down to, volume, intensity, type of exercises you do, and the frequency of how you do them. Volume, again, you say yes, males, females might be a difference to handle volume, but I wouldn't necessarily just say go high volume because they can handle it, or because I think they're females. You'd assess their ability to handle volume. But again, the volume is based on the adaptation that you're trying to achieve. Intensity. There's this idea that, females should do lower intensity, higher reps, males should do higher intensity, lower reps. Well, again, that's ridiculous because the reps and the intensity you do is based off the adaptation you're trying to achieve. Just because someone is, like, if you take an endurance runner, there's a lot of us maybe that are hard gainers, people would quote, um, and would be probably more suited to endurance running. Well, just because you're more suited to endurance running doesn't mean that if you want to gain muscle, I'll make you run. It's, yes, okay, your physiology is more suited to be an endurance runner, but you don't want to be an endurance runner. You want to be someone that lifts heavy stuff and grows muscle. So just because your physiology is suited to one way, that doesn't mean that's the way we train you. We train you for the adaptation. And the adaptation is increase in strength, increase in hypertrophy. So we're going to use high intensities close to failure with moderate to high volumes. Then you start to frequency. There's no reason to say that, there's no research say that females respond better to higher frequencies than males. They can probably handle more frequency because of this absolute load difference, we can say. So from a practical perspective, maybe you do more frequency with them, but they don't necessarily need it. And then the last thing is the type of exercises. Are there female specific exercises and male specific exercises? No, there's not. There's, for hypertrophy, you want to find exercises that brings the muscle through a full range of motion under high degrees of mechanical tension. There's no such thing as female versus male exercises. So again, that's where my thought process is. Based upon the current scientific evidence, there's no strong reason to say that how you program resistance exercise training and set up your program needs to be different between males and females, apart from some minor nuances. Those minor nuances being maybe stay away from percentage based training because of the differences in proximity to failure. What I tend to see when I work with female athletes and I go into an environment, what do I expect to see in that environment? It's not actually physiological based. I expect to see lower technical ability because at a societal level, we don't support and encourage females to engage in resistance training the same way we do in males. In an athlete perspective, I will work with male athletes who have been in a strength and conditioning program since 12 years of age. The females don't get that. They come in at 18 years of age to me and they don't know how to lift. I have to teach them to lift. They're a bit more hesitant in going heavy. I need to say, no, go heavier, go heavier. That's the type of thing. So it's how we coach them tends to be different, not how we write the programs.
Man, my brain is on fire because I liked so much of what you said, pretty much everything, and I have some thoughts. So first, it's really interesting that you're wondering about the difference between whether the difference in training performance comes from absolute load or sex, because that's also something that I've been wondering, because as you said, the difference within individuals of the same sex is really, it can be really great sometimes. I have clients who were assigned female at birth who can lift up to 50 kilograms and they can do more volume than clients who were also assigned female at birth who can lift up to 200 kilograms, as you were saying. So that it's interesting that we came to the same conclusion. And then I'm not going to repeat everything you said about how you coach people, but it's very much the same process that I take, which in the end is based on the individual, not on the sex. I look at this research because it really interests me, but I only use it as a because I'm quite brainy and I like to overthink things essentially. But when it comes to the person in front of me, I'm not thinking, oh, so you were assigned female at birth and you identify as a cis woman. Cool, you get 14 sets for this muscle group, and you identify as a cis man and you were assigned male at birth, so you get 10 sets because you won't be able to recover from as much. I always look at the individual, where do they start? Where are they starting from? Because if they've been training with a certain training volume, to start off with me, I'm not going to change that massively based on their sex. Or if they've never trained at all, I'm not going to throw 14 sets at them because regardless of sex, they're probably not going to recover very well for just that one muscle group. So individualization is what I heard you say, ultimately the most important variable to consider first and foremost, irrespective of sex, menstrual cycle, and birth control. And in terms of a summary of the practical applications, I'm going to give you what I think is a valuable summary. You let me know what you think. So essentially, the sexes there are differences between sexes, but the training methodology doesn't necessarily need to change based on sex, and the training response is relatively similar. The difference is in the absolute response. And also, what I heard you say was that there is no evidence for the necessity or the requirement of using menstrual cycle syncing or phase-based training, or that we need to adjust training based on the menstrual cycle. And the evidence we have right now doesn't seem to suggest that at least oral contraceptives should be or should not be used to favor adaptations.
Yes, I agree with all that. I liked what you said in terms of, and it resonates with one thing I say when treating the individual. Biological sex is a factor to consider, but it should not be the factor that
Yeah.
governs everything. It's just one of many other important factors to consider when designing a program.
And if anything, what came up for me as you were talking is that there has been too much emphasis on biological sex. Because, as you were saying, society doesn't support female athletes in the same way as it does male athletes. And if there are sex differences that seem to be sex based, they could be due to the fact that females are not taught to start lifting at 12 years old. So even when you were mentioning that research that seems to show that maybe in females, the response to resistance training in the upper body is greater. Well, what came up for me was, well, what if it's just because they don't train the upper body as much as a male would do out of personal preference or being told that if they do that, they get bulky or other reasons. So essentially, they're more untrained in the upper body than in the lower body, and that's why they respond better.
Yeah, that's my working hypothesis on that too. That because that data is in untrained individuals, so I would argue that because differences in social play, um, growing up, that the average untrained female is more untrained in the upper body than the average untrained male due to these differences and in play patterns and different things throughout childhood and adolescence.
All right, so I've already stolen an extra 10 minutes of your time because, if in case you can't tell, I get quite passionate about this topic. I find it really interesting for many reasons. But I just want to say a massive thank you for coming on the podcast. And now I want to make sure that if anybody wants to work with you as their coach, or if they want to read more about your work, they know where to find you.
Yeah, 100%. So my email address is david.nolan@dcu.ie. And then across social media, I'm at Synapse Performance on Instagram. So SYNAPSE Performance. And then on Twitter or X, it's David_Synapse.
David_synapse. Excellent. I'm going to put all of these links in the show notes. Thank you again for coming on the podcast. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in as always. And until next time. Lastly, If you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.